I'm a journalist, second journalist of the day to appear on stage. I'm a journalist by trade, and I'm a lot of other things now by accident, including a founder, a CEO, which if you knew me before all of this, you would think was quite a laughable endeavor, me running a business. And also a speaker. As it turns out, when you start something, sometimes you end up doing a lot of these kind of speaking gigs, and I've done a lot of them in particular over the last year because the publishing industry has a real conferencing problem. Like, they'll try to conference themselves out of every single problem that they have in the industry. So I've spoken at a lot of publishing conferences, and I've also spoken to everyone from local meetup to, I'll basically speak to a knitting group if I think it'll sell a couple of copies of one of our stories. But as it happens, I think this is probably the most intimidating group that I've ever spoken in front of. And the reason is both the people that you've seen before and the people that I've met here over the weekend. You know, it's an incredibly creative and talented group of people. So it's hard for me to believe that I have anything to impart in terms of advice for you when it comes to technology or business or anything else. So I'm going to do the only thing that I actually am maybe sort of good at, which is I'm going to tell you a story. And the story has 5 chapters, and it has characters. It's told in the first person, and it has some conflict. It has some drama. The ending is not quite as tidy as I would like, but we'll see how it goes. It has a lesson. So, chapter 1. As Andy mentioned, a couple of years ago, in August of 2009, I set out from my apartment in San Francisco. I got in the car. I took the battery out of my cell phone. I drove across the Bay Bridge. And I went into a life with an entirely new identity. So for a month, my plan was to abandon everything in my life and see if I could adopt a new identity. And part of the reason I wanted to do that was that I was really intrigued with people who'd faked their own death. And I had interviewed some people who faked their own death, but I kind of wanted to inhabit that story myself. I wanted to see what it felt like to fake your own death. So Wired agreed to let me do an article about it. They started this contest. They said people could find me. And I set off. I was going to try to stay missing for a month. And in the process of that, I wasn't a real fugitive, so I wasn't really in danger of being caught and sent to prison or anything, but I did, if you are familiar with it or you read the article, I took it quite seriously. And in the process, I shot some videos along the way, none of which have ever been seen by anyone. And this is one, and I'll warn you, this both has graphic and embarrassing imagery of me.
And so they agreed to cut my hair out like this. Took some explaining.
It's part of my disguise.
And it took some convincing also. They didn't really want to do it, but they kind of got into it and they thought it was funny. And I promised that I would come back and get the rest of it shaved off at a later point. So this is what I've got. It's not perfect. It needs, I'll have to polish it up a little bit here. And we'll see if that is enough to get me through what I think is going to be some number of people looking for me in Salt Lake City.
So there's a lot more, but it doesn't necessarily get better from there. So I shot all these videos, and I never did anything with them, but I came back and I wrote this story. It was published in the magazine. It was 9,000 words, which is, for a magazine story today, is quite a long piece. And it came out, and it got more feedback than anything that I've ever written and probably ever will write. It'll probably be in my tombstone, hey, you're that guy that tried to disappear one time. And the interesting thing about it was that it was posted online, it was in the magazine. The magazine sold, as many single copy sales as they had in many years. Online, it was a huge, huge hit. And one thing they discovered was that a lot of people were reading to the end of this story. The story was 9,000 words online. It had the sort of paginated thing at the bottom. I'm not even sure they had a single-page version of it at the time. And a lot of people were reading it online. And so my editor, Nicholas Thompson, and I, we started talking about, well, why can't you do this in the digital world? Why can't you do a story of this length and this depth in the digital world? And there's a couple possible reasons for it. One is it's expensive. It's expensive to do a story like this. The second one is that nobody reads it. But it seemed like people were reading it, so maybe that one was a little bit dodgy. And the other thing we wondered was, what if you took a story like this and you conceived it as digital from the beginning? So all the contests and everything had taken place online, but then the story ended up in print. But what if it was a digital story? What if we could do things like utilize video in the actual narrative of the story? Now, maybe it would have ruined it. The videos I took were pretty crappy. But maybe it could have added a whole nother layer to the way we told the story. So what we decided to do was try and launch a little publishing project that would let people do both of those things, both tell long stories and do it in a digital way where it was digital first, and we were considering how would you use other media? How would you use an audiobook? How would you use video? How would you use maps and timelines and characters and weave them into the story itself? So that's all well and good to say we were going to do that, but neither Nick nor I could code our way out of a paper bag, so we needed a third person. We found this guy, Jefferson Rabb, who is a brilliant designer and programmer, and he built what eventually became our app. And so we decided to launch not on the web, but only for phones, tablets, and e-readers, and we would publish these stories. We'd do basically one a month. We would hire a writer to go out and do them, and we had two basic principles when we started. The first one was that the writers would be paid from the beginning, and not paid like web rates paid, but like paid in a real way that a magazine writer gets paid, so $5,000. Plus, they would get a 50% royalty on the story. So we would sell these stories individually, like little books, and the writer would get half of what we would get. Now, we negotiated up and down, that sort of thing, but that was our basic operating principle. And then the second principle was we would try to do these sort of very narrative stories, because we were going to be asking people, hey, you should pay for this. And as we all know, there's an infinite amount of reading material available on the web at any time. So if you're going to say, no, you should read this 10,000-word story, this is one you should pay for, then you had to make an argument that it was something they couldn't read anywhere else. And for us, that meant narrative journalism. So we got together, we launched this, we hired some writers. In January of 2011, we flipped the switch. Now, back in 2009, about the same time I was disappearing, outside of Stockholm, there was a helicopter that took off at 4:30 in the morning, headed for a depot called G4S in downtown Stockholm. It's a cash depot. It holds $150 million at any given time. And the helicopter had 4 people in it, pilot, an explosives guy, and 2 guys for muscle. And they were planning to rob this depot. They were part of a crew of 20 people that were intending to rob this depot. And so at about 5, just after 5, the security cameras at the depot picked up the following. Sledgehammer to break through this strange skylight that was on top of a building with $150 million in it. So that's the actual footage from the robbery itself. And in the story, it was one of the first stories that we launched with, if you go to our app and you buy the story, it actually opens with that footage. And then after the footage, you start to read about the planning of the heist all the way up until that event, and then afterwards as the authorities try to track it down. So this was the kind of thing that we'd been thinking of. Was there a way to sort of merge these two mediums, to sort of experiment with different ways of pulling people into a story and then telling the story, whether it's through text, whether it's through photos, or whether it's through surveillance video. So we put out our first couple of stories, and then I started getting invited to talk at these publishing conferences, and people had two reactions if I showed them something like that. One of them was, how do you guarantee the quality of what you're doing? That was a common thing that publishers would ask us, because of course, I paid my own way to go report this story. I went out for 2 weeks to Sweden, I talked to the prosecutors, I got the documents, I got a translator to do the translation, and their question was, well, if it's just a few guys sitting around making these stories, how will we know that it will be the quality of the kind of things that the publishing industry produces? And it's a sort of interesting dynamic where the publishing industry sort of assumes that there's a relationship between size and kind of editorial control, that in order to do things that are high quality, that involve great writers, you need editors, and to have editors, you need a huge building on Park Avenue that has 20 floors. But the truth is, in a small shop, you can do all of the things that a big publisher does, and more, as long as you keep your overhead low. So we do things like fact-checking. Every story gets fact-checked. Every story is copy-edited. We hire photographers to go shoot things. We license video. We license photos. We keep a small budget, but in having a small operation, we think we're able to do everything that someone at a large publisher can do. We can maintain the same standards of quality. Now, the other thing I heard, which probably someone out there is thinking right now, was, isn't this just like CD-ROMs? It's just like CD-ROM. Remember when CD-ROMs? Everyone said multimedia storytelling, and it's going to be big, and then it's big for like a year, 2 years, 5 years, and a couple people made a lot of money, and then it all disappeared. Which to me, I mean, that could be true. But the idea of being able to sort of, I use CD-ROMs, so it is kind of funny if I think back of the CD-ROMs I actually use and the difference between that and, say, holding an iPad in your hands. But it's also the case that we're trying to figure out ways to really make the experience of reading feel different. And just to give you a quick example, this is a story by a writer named Chris Beam that we published earlier this year. She, unfortunately, had a very difficult upbringing. Her mother was a prostitute. She was abusive. It was a very difficult household. She left when she was 14 years old. And when she left, she only took a couple of things with her. She never saw her mother again in her life. One of the things she took with her was a diary from when she was 7 years old. And she kind of gave us this diary, and she delivered to us this beautiful memoir of her time growing up. But if you hold this thing in your hands and you flip through it, it adds another dimension to the story to sort of see the 7-year-olds writing about, today my mother didn't love me. And so what we tried to do was figure out a way if we could put that into the reader's hands. So it's not perfect, but it doesn't feel to me exactly like a CD-ROM. So we launched these stories, and as people talked about yesterday, we were on the kind of verge in the late, let's say, spring of 2011 of basically turning our project, what we thought was a kind of a side project, into a company. And in doing that, we started to encounter a lot of challenges. So back in 1967, Brian Wilson, who was the leader, sometimes still is the leader of the Beach Boys, was in the studio trying to create a follow-up to Pet Sounds. I'm sure you all know Pet Sounds. And if you're a Beach Boys aficionado, then you probably know about Smile. So this is the album that was supposed to come after Pet Sounds. It was going to be his masterpiece. He called it a teenage symphony to God. And in the process of trying to create it, he was becoming completely obsessed with it, and he was also kind of losing his mind. So there was a writer named Jules Siegel who was there with him at the time, who was spending months with him while he was in the studio, and witnessing the process, both the creative process and this person completely losing their mind in the process of trying to create this. And Jules wrote a story about it which was in Cheetah magazine in 1967, which lasted about 2 months. And the story kind of disappeared. You can find it in some anthologies, and we decided to republish it. And there's a section where Brian Wilson has all these people over at his house, including Jules, and he's playing the tapes that he's recorded, some of which he later just destroyed because he decided they weren't good enough. But if you buy a copy of the story in the app and you're reading along, and you get to the part where he describes how this sound sort of comes through the stereo while they're sitting around the dinner table, whoops. So that was the sort of thing we wanted to build. But some of you may also be familiar with this, that we had a situation where we had a developer, and eventually a couple of developers, and then we had other people like me saying, hey, can you put a sound clip on that? And then at 4 a.m., hey, can you build this? Hey, hey, can you do this? What if we put this here and that? Without any regard to how difficult any of that was to program, or I don't know anything about that. So it seems like you can work magic, so make it do this. And Jefferson, my co-founder, had a solution to that, which is he wanted to turn what he was doing into an actual publishing platform, primarily for the reason that I would stop bothering him about it. So over the course of a couple months, he did that. He created a sort of platform that allows us to do this. It allows us to mix in video and audio. It allows us to do multimedia publishing, and it allows us to push things out to different environments, so to apps, to ebooks, and to the web, which we're launching in the coming week. So it's a sort of central place. People call it content management system, publishing system, whatever. And this is where I would probably show you an image of it, but I can just tell you it looks like software. Software that's not very exciting to show up here. It's more fun to play with than it is to show. But once he built that, and we started showing it to people, we discovered that there were other people that sort of had the same problem as us. They were sort of trying to figure out, how do we publish to these different environments? How do we maybe experiment with multimedia? And they wanted to license it from us. So that, to us, gave us a little bit of a solution to how are we turning our project into a company? How are we going to make this sustainable over the long term, besides just selling stories? Some of the stories sell very well. Some of them don't sell as well. And so we started licensing it to people, and people have done some pretty interesting things. So I don't know if you've ever seen TED Books. They have a line of books, but it runs on the platform. And this story by Dan Grossman is about climate change and the climate scientists and how they're trying to uncover the way that climate change is unspooling around the world. So they've done some pretty cool multimedia features with it. You can build all these things inside the app. He went all over Australia talking to these people, and he's a great photographer as well. And then we're doing things like the Paris Review app, and they have decades of archives of interviews with writers, of images, of writers' notebooks. So that's Gay Talese's notebook for a famous story for Esquire called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. So we started doing these licensing deals, and we were making some money on that, and we were making money selling stories, and so here we have a business. But about probably a year ago, and I don't remember the time exactly because this happened at least 4 or 5 times, our founders got together in a bar, and I came in, and I got a drink, and I said, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I quit. Let's shut it down. Let's not do it. And the reason was, everybody was working 80, 90 hours a week, or I was working 80, 90 hours a week at least, and it seemed like we couldn't get big and we couldn't stay small. So we were sort of stuck at this level where everyone had to work themselves to death in order to keep putting out these stories. Now, we love putting out these stories. We like working with the people we're licensing with, but it seemed like we were sort of on a treadmill that was impossible to maintain. So we sort of sat around, staring into our drinks, saying, all right, we're not going to do this anymore. And then we had a couple drinks, and then we started to feel, you got that confidence, that kind of fuck you confidence going. And then we said, well, you know what, maybe we've never really tried to make it bigger. Maybe, in fact, we're sort of intentionally trying to keep it small because As long as we keep it small and we say, this is just a little project that we have, then if it doesn't work out, we can say, well, we were just messing around. But if we try to turn it into a big company, not a big company, but a real company, then it could fail, and then people will be out of jobs, and I'll feel really bad about it. But eventually we said, you know what? Let's do this. Let's turn this into a real thing. Let's make it bigger. So there's a book out right now by a guy named Jonathan Gottschall, which is called The Storytelling Animal. And it's a really, really good book. And he sort of walks through how storytelling has been a part of human history, from ancient history all the way up to what happens in television, what happens on the internet today. And he makes the argument, pretty persuasive argument, that storytelling, a much sort of overused word, but in a very general sense, storytelling is the fundamental cohering human experience. And I mention this because when we started licensing our platform and we started saying, trying to tell people about it and doing like a modicum of marketing, we started getting at first hundreds and then thousands of emails from people who wanted to use it to tell stories. Some of them were family histories, some of them were just things they were interested in, some of them were church newsletters. It was sort of stories very broadly defined. And we said, okay, sure, you can license the platform. It starts at 5 figures. And all of them said, that's not exactly what we had in mind. And so we just sort of ignored them for a very long time. But when we made this decision, okay, we're going to try to turn this into a real company, we started saying, well, what do we do with those people? Is there a way that we can open up this platform for those people? And is there also a way that, in the same way that we're trying to make a living for writers who do this professionally, we can provide a space for someone to create using this platform, maybe even sell stories using this platform, and make their own living? So that's what we decided to do. And we're in the process of doing that now. And we've had some people in the beta for a couple of months, and we're, to be honest, incredibly slow getting out of the beta, partly because we're just sort of stumbling around. We're not sure what people want to use it for. A couple of things that people have used it for, we've got journalists. This is an organization called Story Us, which basically sends journalists, a lot of journalists, to the same place to report on something. In this case, they reported on a year after the Joplin tornado. And they kind of descend on the area, and they do a series of long-form stories, collections of photography. We've had some fiction in there. We've had some educators doing courses and things like that. We've had photographers. This is a photographer who went and had shot clothing after the Japanese tsunami, and sort of clothing that washed up, abandoned clothing. So people are kind of experimenting, and we're experimenting. And if I can make one request, it's that among all the sort of people in this room, creative people, we'd love to have you come to us and tell us what you might want to do with this. I mean, it's as simple as we're trying to figure out what people want, and we're trying to provide the platform that they can do it with. So in 2006, there was this Ethiopian boy. He grew up in Ethiopia, but he was sort of sold into servitude in South Africa. And he lived with this guy who was a sort of abusive master, and then the guy died. And this Ethiopian kid had to figure out what he was going to do with himself. He couldn't live there. He was 12 years old. He didn't know what to do. So he had one contact that he knew at a restaurant, and he decided to get that guy to help him make his way to America. And he did. And now he works in a retail store on Long Island. And his journey from there to here is incredible. And there's a reporter named Tori Marlin from Chicago who's been reporting on this kid for years. The kid's older now. And she got together with Joshua Neufeld, who's a comics artist, to try to tell this story visually. And this is the story that we're publishing this coming week. We haven't shown it to anyone yet. In fact, I think this is just a development version of it. But we're trying to find ways, both for us and for anyone else who uses the platform, to sort of rethink how storytelling works, and to say, in the era where everything is short, is there a way to tell long stories that are engaging? So if there's something that we want, if there's a story we want to tell that doesn't fit in with what we have, we build the technology to try and do it. So there's a soundtrack to this. It's an amazing story, and for the first time, we'll actually be selling it on the web as opposed to just in mobile apps. So that's kind of where we are right now. We're both doing our own publishing and in the sort of anti-lean startup idea, or whatever it's called, we're also trying to provide a place for other people to do that and turn both of those things into a business. Now, I said that I didn't really have any advice for you, and I probably don't, but if there's one lesson that we've learned, we've been at this now for a couple of years, I would say this. So the other day there was a blog post by Malik, and some of you probably know Malik, some of you probably know him personally. He's a blogger, he started GigaOM, and I have a great deal of respect for him, and this post was entitled Creativity. And he was making the argument that in the digital world, there's a type of creativity in being brief. There's a type of creativity in saying, my audience only has a certain amount of attention, and I need to meet the needs of that attention. So he threw out this number, or this time, 1.5 minutes. If you only have 1.5 minutes of someone's attention, then there's really creativity in making sure that your news or your message fits into that 1.5 minutes. But while I think that's true, I think there's a lot of truth in that argument, I would say that for us, we recognize that we live in that world, but we don't want to create for that world. We want to create for a world in which there's room for this kid's story to be told, and there's room for Chris Beam's story to be told about her upbringing, and there's room for all these people to come and tell their own stories and find an audience for them. Now, we're trying to sort of like create a slice of the world in which that's true. And you may say that's just wishful thinking. The world is as it is, and it's a 90-second world. But my one piece of advice for everyone who is in this room, who's creative, who's talented, who has the resources to carry through that talent, is to try and create the world that you want to live in. So you don't have to live in the 90-second world. I mean, maybe you do. But if you look at the projects that you've seen, if you look at all the speakers up here, they're all trying to do that. They're all trying to sort of envision a world that they want to live in, where arts get funded, where games get funded, and then they try to create that. And the truth is, most of it is not going to work out. So a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, you may say, hey, remember that asshole who got up and said, people will buy long-form stories, and people will tell long-form stories, and isn't that ridiculous? And whatever happened to that guy? Isn't he the guy that tried to disappear? But if you do try it, there's a chance that even for a limited period of time, and that's what we're in right now, a limited period of time, you actually can create that world. And there's nothing better than living in the world that is the one that you imagine. So I imagine a world where writers get paid to go out and do narrative long-form stories all around the world, and it exists, at least in a small form right now. And if you don't do it, if you say, all right, well, we live in the 90-second world, so that's what I'm going to do, then you're really just living in a story that's being written by someone else. So, thanks.